November 1945. Camp Seagoville, Texas. The mess hall smelled like cinnamon and butter, scents that made the 43 German women prisoners simultaneously homesick and resentful. Oberleutnant Katharina Vogel, a professionally trained pastry chef who'd once supplied desserts to officers' clubs across occupied France, stared at the golden-crusted pie before her with undisguised contempt. "This is not baking," she announced loudly enough for the American cooks to hear. "This is sugar poison wrapped in flour. Real apple desserts require skill, not just dumping ingredients into a pan." Around her, the other German women nodded in agreement, their loyalty to Apfelstrudel tradition absolute. What none of them knew was that in 3 hours, this sugar poison would break through their defenses in a way no amount of military defeat could, by tasting exactly like the home they'd lost, the families they missed, and the childhood memories they'd been trying so hard to protect. The smell hit Katharina like a physical blow: cinnamon, nutmeg, butter, apples baking in their own juices, sugar caramelizing at the edges of a crust. For a moment, she was 7 years old again, in her Oma Elizabeth's Stuttgart bakery, standing on a wooden stool to reach the counter, learning to crimp the edges of an Apfelkuchen while autumn rain drummed on the windows. Then, reality crashed back. She wasn't in Stuttgart, she was in Texas. It wasn't 1924, it was November 1945. The bakery was gone, destroyed by Allied bombs. Oma was dead. And the smell triggering this devastating nostalgia wasn't coming from proper German Apfelstrudel, but from what she'd spent 6 weeks calling American sugar garbage. Sergeant Dorothy Martinez emerged from the kitchen carrying yet another pie, her expression patient despite the constant criticism she'd endured from the German prisoners since their arrival in October. She was a sturdy woman in her early 30s with the practical demeanor of someone who'd grown up working hard and expected others to do the same. "Ladies," Martinez said in careful German, "tonight is Thanksgiving. It's an American holiday about gratitude and abundance. We're serving traditional foods including apple pie, which has been made in this country for over 200 years. You don't have to eat it, but I'm asking you to at least try it before deciding it's inferior." Katharina stood, her posture rigid with professional authority. "Sergeant Martinez, I have been baking professionally since I was 16 years old. I studied at Stuttgart's finest culinary academy. I know quality pastry when I see it, and this," she gestured dismissively at the pies, "is not quality, it is quantity. American baking prioritizes speed and sweetness over technique and refinement." Several women murmured agreement. Margareta Schaffer, a former teacher who'd become Katharina's closest ally in maintaining German standards, added, "In Germany, our Apfelstrudel is so thin you can read newspaper through the dough. That requires skill. This American pie with its thick crust requires only, what is the word? Laziness?" Martina's expression didn't change, though something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but something like weary recognition. "Mrs. Vogel, have you ever actually tasted American apple pie?" The question hung in the air. Katharina felt her face flush. "I don't need to taste something to recognize poor technique. The construction tells me everything. Thick crust to hide mistakes, excessive sugar to compensate for lack of flavor development, no artistry in presentation." "So that's a no," Martinez replied quietly. She set down the pie she'd been carrying and cut a generous slice, steam rising from the filling. "Then how about this? I won't ask you to like it. I'm just asking you to taste it before you teach 42 other women to reject it, sight unseen." The challenge was clear, and Katharina felt the weight of every German woman's eyes on her. She'd positioned herself as their culinary authority, their voice of resistance against American cultural imperialism. If she backed down now, that authority would crumble. "I will taste it," Katharina said, her voice cold. "And then I will explain in detail why it fails to meet proper baking standards." Martinez nodded, placing the slice on a plate. Then she added something that made several German women gasp, a large scoop of vanilla ice cream directly on top of the hot pie, where it began melting immediately into the crevices. "This is how Americans eat it," Martinez explained, "a la mode, hot and cold together." Katharina stared at the plate. The combination looked absurd, messy, completely lacking the elegant presentation she'd been trained to value. but the smell rising from it, warm apples and cinnamon mixing with cold vanilla cream, triggered another involuntary memory flash of her grandmother's kitchen, of comfort and safety and home. She picked up the fork with the deliberate movements of someone approaching an unpleasant task. The other German women watched in complete silence, this moment representing more than just dessert. It was about whether they would continue unified resistance or begin the slow process of accommodation. The fork cut through the crust easily, perhaps too easily for proper lamination. The filling was thick with apple slices, swimming in their own juice mixed with spices. The ice cream was already melting into everything, creating a mess that would have horrified her instructors at Culinary Academy. Katharina lifted the fork to her mouth, aware that she was being watched by both German prisoners and American guards, aware that this simple act carried symbolic weight beyond mere eating. She opened her mouth, tasted, and her entire world tilted on its axis. It tasted like home. Not like Stuttgart specifically, not like any particular recipe she'd learned at Academy, but like home in the most fundamental sense, like childhood autumn afternoons, like her grandmother's weathered hands guiding hers, like the moment before everything collapsed into war and loss and exile. The apples were tender but not mushy, seasoned with just enough cinnamon and nutmeg. The crust wasn't refined, but it was buttery and flaky, and the vanilla ice cream melting into the warm filling created a temperature and texture contrast that was, objectively speaking, brilliant. She swallowed. The mess hall was completely silent. Katharina's silence stretched uncomfortably long. She took another bite, then another, her expression unreadable. The German women watched her with a mixture of anticipation and concern, waiting for her professional verdict, for the articulate condemnation that would validate their collective resistance. Finally, Margaret spoke up. "Well, tell us how it fails to meet standards." Katharina set down her fork carefully, staring at the half-eaten slice. "It doesn't," she said quietly. "What?" Margaret leaned forward. "I didn't hear you." "It doesn't fail," Katharina repeated, louder this time, her voice carrying a note of confusion that bordered on distress. It's good. Very good." The reaction was immediate. Some women looked betrayed, others shocked, a few curious. Liesel Braun, a young prisoner who'd been secretly interested in American food since arrival, looked vindicated. "You're saying this is acceptable?" Margaret asked, clearly struggling to process this admission from the woman who'd been their most vocal critic of American cooking. "I'm saying it's more than acceptable," Katharina replied, her professional honesty overriding pride. "The crust has proper butter content, the filling is well balanced, the spicing is subtle rather than overwhelming. It's different from strudel, yes, but it's not inferior. It's just different." She looked up at Sergeant Martinez, who stood quietly observing. "How do you achieve this texture in the apples? They're tender but still hold their shape." Martinez's expression softened slightly. "We use a mix of apple varieties, some that break down during baking, some that stay firmer, and we toss them with a little flour to absorb excess moisture. Different technique than strudel, but the goal is the same good eating experience." Katharina nodded slowly, her trained mind automatically analyzing what she'd tasted. "The ice cream addition is ingenious. The temperature contrast creates sensory interest that compensates for the dessert's visual simplicity." Around the table, other German women were watching this exchange with fascination. Their authority figure wasn't condemning American baking. She was analyzing it with professional respect. "Does this mean we're allowed to try it?" Liesel asked tentatively. Katharina looked at the young woman, seeing in her face the same curiosity and hunger for new experiences that she herself had felt as a young apprentice baker. She'd been stifling that in the other prisoners for 6 weeks, using her credentials to enforce rigid adherence to tradition. "You don't need my permission," Katharina said finally. "You never did." But she knew that wasn't true. These women had needed someone to follow, someone to tell them how to maintain dignity in defeat, and she'd been telling them that dignity meant rejection, that cultural pride required refusing everything American. Now she'd just undermined that entire framework by admitting the enemy's dessert was actually good. The dinner proceeded with notable tension. Some women approached the pie table tentatively, taking small slices while glancing back at Katharina as if seeking ongoing permission. Others, particularly the older prisoners who'd invested heavily in the narrative of German superiority, refused to even look at the desserts. Frida Koch, a former nurse in her 40s who'd been one of Katharina's staunchest supporters, remained seated with arms crossed. "So you tasted it and found it adequate. That doesn't mean we must all abandon our standards and embrace American culture wholesale." "I'm not asking you to abandon anything," Katharina replied. "I'm just saying I was wrong to judge without tasting. As a professional, I should have known better." "As a German, you should know that accepting their food sends a message," Frida countered, "that we're willing to be assimilated, that our culture is negotiable." The accusation stung because Katharina had been thinking exactly the same thing for weeks. She'd positioned food resistance as cultural preservation, teaching the other women that every meal was a battleground where they could assert their German identity against American dominance. But now, with the taste of excellent apple pie still on her tongue, with the sensory memory of her grandmother's kitchen triggered by something she'd been calling inferior, Katharina felt the foundations of her certainty crumbling. Maybe food wasn't a battlefield. Maybe it was just food. That evening, after the Thanksgiving dinner had ended and the women had returned to their barracks, Katharina found herself unable to sleep. She lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of 42 other women settling in for the night-whispered conversations in German, the creaking of metal bed frames, someone crying quietly as homesickness overwhelmed them. She'd been at Camp Seagoville for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of organizing resistance, of teaching cultural pride, of insisting that German standards must be maintained even in captivity. And in 6 weeks, what had it accomplished? The women were no less prisoners. Germany had won no moral victories. And tonight, several of them had eaten apple pie and discovered it was delicious, exactly as she had. The memory of that first bite haunted her. It had tasted like home, but home didn't exist anymore. The Stuttgart bakery was rubble. Oma Elizabeth was gone. Her father, who'd run the business side of the family enterprise, had died in the war. Her mother and younger sister Anneliese were somewhere in the ruins of Germany, surviving on rations and hope. Katharina had been captured in France while serving with a Wehrmacht administrative unit, processed through displaced persons camps, and eventually shipped to Texas with other German women deemed low-security prisoners. The journey had been bewildering, terrifying, and ultimately anticlimactic. Instead of punishment or harsh treatment, they'd found themselves in a camp with adequate food, medical care, and American guards who seemed more interested in maintaining order than extracting revenge. That had almost been harder to accept than cruelty would have been. If the Americans had been brutal, it would have confirmed everything she'd been taught about them. Instead, their basic decency forced cognitive dissonance that Katharina had resolved by focusing on cultural superiority. "We may have lost the war," she'd told herself and others, "but we haven't lost our civilization, our refinement, our standards." Except tonight, American dessert had tasted like the best parts of her German childhood, and now she didn't know what to think. She rolled over, reaching under her pillow for the letter that had arrived 2 weeks earlier. She'd read it so many times she could recite it from memory, but she pulled it out anyway, squinting in the dim light from the barracks' single bulb to read her sister's cramped handwriting. That night, unable to sleep, Katharina pulled out the letter she'd received 2 weeks earlier from her younger sister Anneliese in Stuttgart. She'd read it dozens of times, but now one paragraph struck her differently. "The bakery is ruins, Kathy. Nothing remains except the old oven, somehow still standing in the rubble. I found Oma Elizabeth's recipe book in the basement, water-damaged but readable. Do you remember her Apfelkuchen? She used to say it was based on a recipe our great-great-grandmother Clara brought from America, of all places. I never understood that until now. How could Germans learn baking from Americans? But I found the original recipe card, dated 1875, and it says, 'Mutter's American Apple Pie, adapted for German tastes.' Kathy, I think our family's most treasured recipe wasn't purely German at all." Katharina's hands trembled holding the letter. Her grandmother's legendary Apfelkuchen, the one that had inspired Katharina's career, The standard by which she'd judged all other apple desserts had American roots. The pie she'd mocked tonight might be closer to her family tradition than the pure German strudel she'd been defending. Morning came too early, bringing with it questions Katharina couldn't answer. She dressed mechanically, going through the routines of camp life, while her mind churned over the implications of Annaliese's letter. If her family's recipe had American origins, if the distinction between German and American baking was less clear than she'd believed, then what had she been defending for the past 6 weeks? At breakfast, the atmosphere among the German women was noticeably different. Small groups huddled in conversation, voices low but intense. Katharina caught fragments as she moved through the mess hall debates about cultural purity, arguments about whether trying American food constituted betrayal, questions about what it meant to maintain German identity when removed from Germany itself. Liesel approached her table cautiously. "Frau Vogel, I wanted to thank you for what you said last night, about us not needing permission. I tried the pie, and it reminded me of something my grandmother used to make in Bavaria. I've been feeling guilty about liking American food, thinking it meant I was forgetting where I came from." "You're not forgetting," Katharina said quietly. "You're just discovering that home might exist in more places than we thought." After breakfast, Sergeant Martinez found Katharina in the recreation yard. "Mrs. Vogel, could I show you something in the kitchen?" Katharina followed her into the mess hall's professional kitchen, a space she'd deliberately avoided since arrival because seeing American cooking facilities had felt like admitting defeat. But now, watching Martinez move through the organized space with practiced efficiency, she felt professional curiosity override pride. Martinez pulled a worn book from a shelf, a cookbook with a faded cover that read, "American Homestead Recipes, 1850. She opened it to a page marked with a piece of paper and set it before Katharina. "Page 47, Martinez said. "Apple pie recipe." "Coy." Katharina read the heading, then the note written in the margin in careful English handwriting. "Original recipe from German immigrant Hannah Schultz, Pennsylvania, 1847. Adapted from her mother's Apfelkuchen from Heidelberg." The words blurred slightly as Katharina stared at them. German immigrants, adapted from Apfelkuchen. Everything she'd been saying about American apple pie being inferior to German traditions, it was the same recipe, just evolved over time in a different place. "There's more," Martinez said gently, pulling out several other recipe cards from the book's pages. "Apple pandowdy from Dutch settlers, choufle pie from Pennsylvania Germans. Half the desserts we call American were brought by European immigrants and adapted to ingredients available here. Your people didn't abandon their baking traditions when they came to America. They transformed them." Katharina's throat tightened. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because last night you were brave enough to admit you were wrong about the taste," Martinez replied. "And I think you're brave enough to understand the bigger truth. American food isn't the opposite of German food. A lot of it is German food that grew up in a different country." She paused, studying Katharina's face. "I'm the daughter of Mexican immigrants, Mrs. Vogel. My mother spent 30 years in Texas adapting her traditional recipes, using different chilies because the Mexican varieties weren't available, substituting ingredients, creating dishes that were neither purely Mexican nor purely American, but something new. I grew up watching people tell her that her food wasn't authentic anymore, that she'd betrayed her heritage by changing it." "But she was just surviving," Katharina said, beginning to understand. She was doing more than surviving. She was creating something that belonged to two worlds instead of one. And that's not betrayal, that's evolution. Martinez gestured to the cookbook. "These German women who came to America in the 1800s, they didn't stop being German when they adapted their Apfelkuchen to American ingredients in ovens. They just became something additional German-American." Katharina touched the recipe page carefully, as if it might dissolve. "My grandmother told stories about our family history, but I never paid attention to the details. I just assumed our traditions were purely German, unchanged for generations." "Most people assume that," Martinez said. "It's easier than accepting that culture is always changing, always borrowing, always evolving. But the evidence is right here in the food. The apple pie you tasted last night, It's as German as it is American, because Germans made it American by bringing it here and adapting it. The implications crashed over Katharina like a wave. She'd spent 6 weeks teaching the other prisoners to reject American food as culturally alien, insisting that maintaining German purity required resistance to American influence. But if German immigrants had been creating American food for 2 centuries, if the boundaries between the cultures were permeable rather than absolute, then her entire framework collapsed. "I need to think about this," Katharina said, her voice unsteady. "Take your time," Martinez replied. "But Mrs. Vogel? Those other women are watching you. You have influence over them. What you do next matters." Katharina spent the rest of the morning in the barracks, lying on her bunk and rereading Annaliese's letter. The bakery is ruins. Oma's recipe book survived. Great-great-grandmother Clara brought it from America. Everything she'd believed about cultural purity was built on incomplete information, on assumptions she'd never questioned. That afternoon, Katharina requested a meeting with Captain Ruth Henderson, the camp commander. Henderson was a practical woman in her 40s who ran Camp Seagoville with firm efficiency, tempered by unexpected kindness. "Mrs. Vogel," Henderson greeted her in the small office. "Sergeant Martinez mentioned you had an interesting conversation this morning." "Captain Henderson, I need to write to my sister in Stuttgart," Katharina said. "I need to ask her specific questions about our family's recipe book, about this great-great-grandmother who supposedly brought a recipe from America back to Germany." Henderson nodded. "Of course. But may I ask why this is suddenly so important?" Katharina hesitated, then decided honesty was simpler than evasion. "Because for 6 weeks I've been teaching the other women that American food is inferior to German food, that accepting it means losing our identity. And last night I discovered that the American pie I've been mocking tastes exactly like my grandmother's Apfelkuchen. Then, this morning, Sergeant Martinez showed me that German immigrants created much of what we call American baking." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "If my family's most treasured recipe has American origins, if the tradition I've been defending isn't purely German at all, then I've been wrong about everything, and I've been leading 42 other women to be wrong along with me." Henderson leaned back in her chair, studying Katharina with an expression that mixed sympathy and calculation. "Mrs. Vogel, do you know why we assigned you to this camp instead of a larger facility? Because we're considered low security risk? Partly, but also because we're running an experiment here. Not all German prisoners will return to Germany after the war. Some will immigrate to America, either by choice or necessity. We're trying to determine the best methods for helping prisoners transition from enemy combatants to potential citizens." The words landed heavily. Katharina hadn't seriously considered staying in America. She'd assumed she'd return to Stuttgart once repatriation became possible, help rebuild the bakery, resume her life. "I'm not staying here," Katharina said automatically. "Maybe not," Henderson replied, "but some of the women in your barracks will. And right now, you're teaching them that American culture is something to resist rather than understand. That makes integration much harder." "So this is about assimilation, about making us forget we're German?" "No," Henderson said firmly. "It's about helping you understand that being German and accepting American food aren't mutually exclusive, that you can honor your heritage while also adapting to new circumstances. Isn't that what your great-great-grandmother Clara did when she brought her baking skills to America?" The parallel was uncomfortably obvious. Katharina had been thinking of herself as different from those German immigrants who'd become American. But they'd face the same choice she faced, now maintain rigid adherence to the old ways, or adapt while preserving what mattered most. "I don't know what matters most anymore," Katharina admitted quietly. Henderson's expression softened. "Then maybe that's what you need to figure out. And maybe helping the other women figure it out too is part of that process." That evening, Katharina called an informal meeting in the barracks. Word spread quickly, and soon most of the 43 German women had gathered, sitting on bunks or standing in small groups, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Margaret spoke first, her tone defensive. "Are you going to tell us we should all eat American pie now? That we should forget our traditions?" "No," Katharina replied. "I'm going to tell you what I learned today. And then I'm going to show you something. She held up Annaliese's letter. My sister found our grandmother's recipe book in the ruins of our family bakery. And she found something I never knew, our most famous recipe, the Apfelkuchen, that inspired me to become a baker, originally came from America. Our great-great-grandmother brought it back from Pennsylvania in 1875 and adapted it for German tastes. The room erupted in whispers. Liesel looked fascinated, Frida looked skeptical, Margaret looked betrayed. That's one family's story, Frida said loudly. It doesn't mean all German baking comes from America. You're right, Katharina acknowledged, but this morning Sergeant Martinez showed me a cookbook from 1850 documenting dozens of American recipes brought by German immigrants. Apple pie, apple pandowdy, various Kuchen, all German recipes that evolved in America. The food I've been calling purely American is actually German-American. It belongs to both cultures. So what are you saying? Margaret demanded. That we should accept American culture because parts of it used to be German. I'm saying the distinction isn't as clear as I thought it was, Katharina replied. I'm saying that when I tasted that apple pie last night, it reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen because it probably tasted almost exactly like what she made. The same recipe, just following a different branch of the family tree. She paused, looking around at faces reflecting confusion, resistance, and in some cases, relief, as if she'd given them permission to admit what they'd been feeling. For 6 weeks, I've been teaching you to reject American food as a way of maintaining German identity. But what if German identity isn't about rejecting everything foreign? What if it's about recognizing that cultures have always mixed, always borrowed, always evolved? Our great-grandmothers brought their recipes to America and created something new. Maybe we're just continuing that tradition. Or maybe you've been seduced by good taste and enemy propaganda, Frida said coldly. I expected more strength from you, Frau Vogel. The accusation hung in the air. Other women shifted uncomfortably, divided between those who saw Katharina's admission as courage and those who saw it as weakness. The barracks felt suddenly smaller, the tension oppressive. Strength? Katharina repeated quietly. Frida, I've spent 6 weeks being strong. I've organized our resistance, defended our traditions, taught everyone that accepting American food meant betraying our culture. And what has that strength accomplished? We're still prisoners. Germany is still in ruins. And some of us, she looked pointedly at several younger women, have been going hungry at meals because they're following my example of rejecting foods they might actually need. Liesel spoke up, her voice tentative but determined. I've been hungry, Frau Vogel. Not starving like people in Germany, but hungry because I've been refusing portions that I thought you'd disapprove of. Last night when you said we didn't need permission, I ate properly for the first time in weeks. That's weakness, Frida insisted. The Americans have abundance, and you're letting that seduce you into forgetting who you are. I'm not forgetting who I am, Katharina replied, her voice strengthening. I'm questioning who I thought I was. There's a difference. I thought I was defending pure German tradition, but it turns out that tradition was never pure. It was always mixed, always evolving, always borrowing from other cultures. She held up the letter again. My great-great-grandmother Clara went to America, learned American baking techniques, and brought them back to Germany. She didn't stop being German. She just became a German who knew something additional. And her daughter and her granddaughter, and eventually my Oma Elizabeth, they all benefited from that borrowed knowledge. Margaret stood, her expression troubled but less hostile than Frida's. But Katharina, if we accept that German and American baking are connected, if we start eating their food and liking it, what happens to us? Do we just dissolve into American culture and disappear? It was the fear underlying all the resistance, Katharina realized. Not really about food at all, but about identity, about survival, about what it meant to be German when Germany itself was broken and occupied. My mother used to tell a story, Katharina said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke. About my Oma Elizabeth's mother, my great-grandmother, who married a man from Bavaria. She was from Prussia. Their wedding almost didn't happen because the families argued about which region's traditions to follow, whose recipes to use, whose customs to honor. She paused, seeing recognition in some faces. Regional differences within Germany had always been significant. They solved it by creating something new, Katharina continued. Prussian dumpling recipes with Bavarian spices, Bavarian meat preparations with Prussian sides. Neither family lost their identity, they just expanded it. And I'm descended from that mixing, from that willingness to see value in different traditions. But Prussia and Bavaria are both German, Frida objected. They didn't used to be. Not in the same country, not with the same identity. My great-grandmother's generation had to learn to think of themselves as German instead of just Prussian or Bavarian. They had to create a larger identity that included both. The parallel was clear, and several women nodded slowly. The Germany they'd known, unified and strong, was less than a century old. Their grandmothers had lived through the creation of that identity. Sergeant Martinez appeared in the barracks doorway, carrying a large basket. "Ladies, I hope I'm not interrupting. Captain Henderson asked me to bring these over." She set the basket on a central table. "There are copies of that cookbook I showed Mrs. Vogel this morning. The one with German immigrant recipes. She thought some of you might want to see where American apple pie actually came from." Martinez met Katharina's eyes with a look of understanding, then left quietly. The women gathered around the table, pulling out the photocopied pages, reading the annotations about German settlers and their adapted recipes. "Look at this one," Liesel said, holding up a page. "Apfelkuchen from Heidelberg, 1847. The note says it was adapted by Hannah Schultz in Pennsylvania, and her daughter brought a version back to Germany in 1870. Katharina, could this be your family?" Katharina took the page, studying it. The dates were close to what Annalisa had mentioned. The city matched Heidelberg, where their family had originated before moving to Stuttgart. "It could be," she said quietly. "The timeline matches. If great-great-grandmother Clara was Hannah Schultz's daughter or granddaughter, this might be the exact recipe that became our family's Apfelkuchen." The women passed the cookbook pages around, reading with growing fascination. The resistance in the room was shifting, not disappearing, but transforming into something more complex: curiosity mixed with defensive pride, interest tempered by caution. "This doesn't mean we have to like American food," Margaret said, but her tone was less combative now. "It just means the history is more complicated than we thought." "Yes," Katharina agreed, "and maybe that means we can taste things with open minds instead of predetermined judgments, not accepting everything blindly, but also not rejecting everything automatically." Frida remained standing apart, arms crossed, unwilling to concede. "Some of us still have principles, Frau Vogel. Some of us remember that these people destroyed our country." "They destroyed the government that started a war," Katharina replied, meeting her eyes steadily. "They're not destroying us. They're feeding us, housing us, and showing us cookbooks that prove our cultures have been connected for generations. If that's destruction, I'll take it over the strength that left our cities in ruins and our families starving." The words were harsher than she'd intended, but they needed to be said. Frida's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing more, simply turning and walking to her bunk. 4 months later, Katharina stood in Camp Seagoville's newly established baking classroom, teaching a mixed group of recently arrived German prisoners and curious American staff. On the counter before her sat 2 desserts, a traditional German Apfelstrudel with paper-thin dough and an American apple pie with lattice crust. Between them lay the photocopied cookbook page showing Hannah Schultz's 1847 recipe. "Today we're learning that baking has no borders," Katharina announced in confident English. Her language skills dramatically improved. "These 2 desserts look different, but they share the same grandmother German immigrants who brought their apple traditions to America and transformed them." Liesel, now her assistant instructor, added fresh samples to plates. Several newly arrived prisoners examined the desserts with the same skepticism Katharina had shown 4 months earlier. The classroom door opened, and Sergeant Martinez entered with a thin woman in her mid-20s, clearly just arrived from Europe. Katharina's heart stopped. "Annalisa." Her sister stood in the doorway, hollow-eyed from the journey but alive. They embraced, both crying, speaking rapid German while the class watched. "I brought it," Annalise whispered, pulling a water-stained book from her bag. "Oma Elizabeth's recipe book. And look," she opened to a page with a pressed flower marking it. The recipe was titled Urgroßmutter Clara's Amerikanischer Apfelkuchen. Katharina studied her great-great-grandmother's handwriting, the annotations about American techniques, the date, Pennsylvania, 1873. The recipe that had traveled from Germany to America and back, evolving at each stage. "We can make it together," Katharina said, "using both traditions, honoring both histories." Martinez approached with 2 plates, each holding a slice of warm apple pie à la mode. "Welcome to America, Miss Vogel. This is how we eat it here." Hey. Anneliese took the plate hesitantly, looking to her sister for guidance. Katharina smiled and took her own slice. "Try it first," Katharina said gently. "Then I'll tell you about great-great-grandmother Clara, about German immigrants and American apple pie, and about learning that home can taste familiar even when it comes from unexpected places." She watched Anneliese take that first bite, saw the surprise and recognition cross her face, the same revelation Katharina had experienced months ago. The apple pie wasn't foreign after all. It was family, just wearing different clothes. Around them, German women and American staff shared dessert and recipes, building bridges from butter and sugar, from honesty and humility, from the courage to admit that cultural pride and cultural exchange weren't enemies but partners in survival. The pie that Katharina had called sugar poison had become her most powerful teaching tool, not because American baking was superior to German baking, but because the distinction itself was false. Food, like people, belonged to more than one place, carried more than one history, and was richer for the mixing.